Damos comienzo a la sesión solemne de recepción del excelentísimo doctor Don Pat Cox como académico correspondiente por Irlanda. El excelentísimo señor secretario procederá a la lectura del acta de elección del nuevo académico.
Don Fernando Casado Juan, académico de número y como secretario de la Junta de Gobierno de la Real Academia de Ciencias, Económicas y Financieras, certifica que en el libro de actas de esta Real Corporación, correspondiente a las Juntas Generales Plenarias de Académicos de Número, figura en fecha de 27 de junio de 2019 el acuerdo válido, entre otros, de nombrar académico correspondiente por Irlanda al excelentísimo doctor Pat Cox, tras seguir todos los requisitos estatutarios y reglamentarios, y para que conste a los efectos de toma de posesión prevista para el próximo día 16 de enero de 2020, firmo la presente en Barcelona a 27 de junio de 2019, con el visto bueno del excelentísimo señor presidente.
Ruego al excelentísimo señor secretario tenga la bondad de acoger y acompañar al nuevo académico y a sus introductores, doctor Carles Gasoliba y doctor señor José Daniel Gubern. Excelentísimo señor doctor Pat Cox, ¿ratificáis vuestra aceptación de ingreso en la academia?
Sí.
¿Prometéis por Dios y vuestro honor guardar su estatuto y trabajar por ella, defendiéndola y aportando vuestra cooperación? En nombre de la Real Academia de Ciencias Económicas y Financieras, confirmamos solemnemente vuestro nombramiento de académico correspondiente por Irlanda.
The chosen topic of my inaugural address to the Academy is tackling the climate change challenge, ultimately a duel between human ingenuity and human folly. Perceiving the climate challenge ultimately as a duel between human ingenuity and human folly, for me owes much to a book first published in 1984 and written by the wonderful American historian Barbara Tuchman, entitled The March of Folly. In her introduction, she comments, and I quote, "Elsewhere than in government, man has accomplished marvels." But she remarks on, quote, "the poorer performance of government than almost any other form of human activity." She refers to four kinds of misgovernment: tyranny, excessive ambition, incompetence, and finally, folly. The latter she describes as the pursuit of policy contrary to self-interest of the state involved. Tuchman defined three criteria by which folly in public affairs is met. Firstly, it must be perceived as counterproductive in its own time and not merely with hindsight. Secondly, a feasible alternative course of action must have been available. And thirdly, the policy in question should be that of a group and not an individual, and should persist beyond any one political lifetime. To quote her again, she wrote, "Wooden-headedness, the source of self-deception, is a factor that plays a remarkably large role in government. Folly's appearance is independent of era or locality. It is timeless and universal. And folly in government has more impact on a greater number than individual follies may have. It consists, Tuchman argues, and I quote, in assessing a situation in terms of preconceived fixed notions while ignoring or rejecting any contrary signs. Living as we now are in an age described by many as post-truth, a vigilant eye for folly is more than ever warranted. Tuchman's first test, that folly must be perceived as counterproductive in its own time, not merely by hindsight, is tested by me tonight against the evidence on climate change. The first part of this essay explores what is the evidence, what are the sources, and what can be concluded about whether we now fully know the circumstances that we face. Climate change risk today is at the top of the World Economic Forum's assessment of risks. It has ridden up the political agenda and through the Greta Thunberg effect has mobilized the consciousness of a rising young global generation. So what explains this transition in thinking? I believe the short answer is that the scientists got it right. While no individual weather episode can be linked to climate change, the pattern of our weather is consistent with the predictions of climate science, and this pattern is set to grow in terms of frequency and intensity with the rise in global warming. Regarding event frequency, compared to 1950, floods are up by a factor of 15. Globally, death from droughts is up by a factor of 10. Deaths from wildfires have grown by a factor of 7. Extreme temperature events, both hot and cold, have increased since 1950 by a factor of 20. Every decade since 1970 has been warmer than the one before. And yesterday, we had further proof that the past decade is the warmest decade since records of global temperatures began. And in this picture, Arctic temperatures are rising 3 times faster than the average. Regarding event intensity, consider the following. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 dumped 40 inches of rain over the Houston area in just 4 days. We have ways of coping with rain, but not when it comes in a deluge. And Houston, which is a major urban zone in a highly developed economy, suffered as easily the difficulties of climate change as the poorest suffer in the most difficult third world circumstances. Typhoon Hagibis on the 12th of October of 2019 disrupted the Rugby World Cup in Japan. Now, this may not have been widely reported in Spain since you don't play so much rugby, but it was rather a thing in my home country of Ireland. People talked about matches which had been cancelled, but we had no commentary on the fact that the highest ever recorded rainfall in Japan, 36 inches of rain in 48 hours, fell at Hakone near Mount Fuji during that typhoon incident. And this was almost totally ignored in the media coverage about cancelled sports events. More than 6 million Japanese were ordered to evacuate, and 74 died in that incident. The evidence abounds all around us. 2019 set heat records across Europe, in Andorra, Austria, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Hungary, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Poland, Slovakia, Spain, and the United Kingdom. On average for Europe, the 20 warmest years since records began have been in the past 22 years, with the most recent years making up the top 4 warmest years in the recorded history on the continent of Europe. Arctic ice loss is 6 times greater today than in the 1980s. Greenland ice melt in 2019 was 1.2 times greater than the previous record set as recently as 2012. In the past 12 months, forest fire records have been established from Siberia to California to Australia. Sea levels have been rising by over 3 millimetres per annum and at an increasing rate, reflecting both rises in temperature and the greater melting of ice caps. The Thames Barrier in London, to keep the city from flooding, closed between 1982 and 1990. It closed 8 times. Since the year 2000, it has closed 144 times, and that rate is an increasing rate. Estimates suggest that 237 million in China, India, Indonesia, Thailand and Vietnam will be at risk of annual coastal flooding by 2050. Last year, there were 484 heat waves across India. India defines a heat wave of at least 2 consecutive days of 45 degrees Celsius temperature or more. There were only 21 such events in 2010. 2019, 484 such events. Chennai, a city of 11 million in India, saw its main water reservoir run dry last summer. Meanwhile, Mumbai was brought to a standstill by the heaviest monsoon rains in a decade. Both records, both in the same country, but different climate phenomena. Africa, Mexico, Brazil, India, and Southeast Asia stand to lose very significant potential output as a result of climate change. And unlike a recession, such losses would be permanent. A World Bank study in 2018 suggests there may be 140 million climate migrants by 2050, with 86 million from sub-Saharan Africa, 40 million from South Asia, and 17 million from Latin America. Half of the world's population depends on the seasonal melting ice from high elevation in the Himalayas and elsewhere. The Himalayas are predicted to lose up to 40% of their ice cap this century, even if the Paris targets are met. These glaciers are vital lifelines for Asian rivers, including the Indus and the Ganges. Once they vanish, water supplies in those regions will be in peril, placing 600 million people under water stress. These are extraordinary and known things from what science has told us. This inventory of outcomes constitutes the known knowns associated with climate change. Of course, many scientists are turning attention to the known unknowns of climate change, the climate-driven feedback loops. These self-reinforcing feedbacks, if they continue, may accelerate global warming and risk triggering tipping points. These tipping points are thresholds beyond which the climate system abruptly and irreversibly changes, irrespective of what we choose to do as human beings. Such triggers could be the irreversible melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, the migration of tropical clouds towards the poles north and south, changes in the conveyor belts of deep ocean currents, such as the Gulf Stream, transporting heat northwards in the Atlantic region, the El Niño southern oscillation affecting so much of the tropics in the Pacific, or the Indian Ocean dipole currently impacting surface temperature and the recent drought in Australia. A tipping point could be wide-scale deforestation of rainforests or melting tundra in Siberia and elsewhere, which in some warm temperature scenarios could release trapped methane by the end of this century, equivalent to half of all of the CO2 produced by humanity since the Industrial Revolution. The International Panel on Climate Change consensus suggests that these tipping points are not yet well understood and that they may not be triggered until the global temperature rises beyond the current thresholds. But ignoring these until they pass the point of no return is inadvisable in any risk-based option. This is the Royal Academy for Economics and Finance. So let me put aside the science and ask, is there other evidence? Shifting from climate scientists to finance, corroborating evidence can be found from other well-researched sources. Swiss Re is a leading reinsurance company. It reports both increased risks and increased insurance payouts. In the United States, they report on average that there were 5 $1 billion insurance payout events annually from 1980 to 2015. That there were 5 €1 billion payouts annually 1980 to 2015. Their more recent reports, 2016, 17 and 18, show there were 15 such payouts, jumping from 5 payouts of 1 billion to 15 for one company. Munich Re, which is the biggest reinsurance company in the world, in its 2018 Geo-Risk report, put some number together on this issue. Analysing 2017, Munich Re reported total losses globally from 710 natural catastrophes, including those that were not insured, cost $330 billion of losses. 97% of the 710 natural catastrophes were weather-related. The rest were earthquakes or volcanoes, but 97% of what the insurance companies paid were weather-related. The Bank of England supervises the 4th largest insurance market in the world. Its Governor, Mark Carney, speaking at the United Nations Climate Action Summit in September of 2019, reported that insurance losses in 2018 were double the inflation-adjusted average of the past 30 years. So taking the losses over 30 years, adjusting for inflation, the recent losses are double what the inherited traditional losses had been. And for those of you who like to go through statistics and the bell curve with the normal distribution and tail risk at the beginning and the end, he had something really interesting to say as an economist. He said, yesterday's tail risk, these are the words of Mark Carney, yesterday's tail risk is today's central scenario. That is a dramatic change. And those are the words not of some hippie activist. These are the words of the Governor of the Bank of England talking about the prudential supervisory requirements of the 4th largest insurance industry in the world. So there is the climate science evidence, but there is the economic and financial evidence, of which the insurance evidence is shouting to us as loudly as the scientific evidence that something dramatic is happening. But for government to work, it needs the consent of the government. And we've seen in France, a small proposed increase in fuel tax was the trigger for the Gilets jaunes movement, making implementation a particular challenge. In Norway, there is a new no-toll movement as the attempt to put tolling and congestion charges in cities was made. In Australia, the current government elected last summer got elected by criticising urban snobs who didn't understand real life when it came to the implications of decarbonising Australia. The Prime Minister, of course, is now caught in the quandary of the worst crisis in modern Australia to do with the impact of climate change, and probably and inescapably they're going to have to sit down and reassess what they've been doing. We need to identify and seek to compensate losers. We need to convince public opinion of the air, health and environmental benefits of what we propose to do. But to succeed the net zero target, requires political support. Let me conclude. I'm sure you're glad I'm getting to that point, and I've tried your patience. Many climate deniers are profoundly hostile to this agenda. They seek comfort in attacking scientists rather than the science, as with the ClimateGate affair in 2009. Or they find comfort in launching smear campaigns against activists such as Greta Thunberg. Or they seek strength in numbers through partisan and polarized politics. Many other people are concerned about this, but they are inactive. They are more ignorers than deniers, engaging in wishful thinking, false optimism, or feeling secure in their own comfort zone. Awareness has risen dramatically, but as we saw recently in the Conference of Parties in Madrid just a few weeks ago, change is still very hard to find a consensus around. But the challenges we face today will, according to scientific prediction, pale into insignificance compared to what they could be in higher temperature environments. And I believe the scientific record is unimpeachable based on sound evidence. The next business cycle or the next electoral cycle are horizons whose tragedy is that they fail to encompass the intergenerational consequences of failing to act now. To paraphrase Robert Schumann's famous declaration of the 9th of May 1950, I will talk not about Europe but about our planet, that our planet, quote Schumann, cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten us. Those words of Schumann applied to this scenario are powerful words of encouragement echoing across decades of our history. I will close with a personal credo. I've talked about facts. I've talked about scientists. What do I feel for myself? I think that many feel that sustainability is a global issue, but they worry that it's beyond their personal agency to make a difference. It's just too big. That is why government leadership is essential, to act as a moral multiplier, to act as a mobilizer, and to close the gap between vague goodwill, which many have, and concrete choices and actions, which only governments can propose in our democracy. This is not someone else's problem. This is ours. We are not bystanders. Each in our own way is an actor in this great human and planetary drama. Each can do something. Again, I want to quote Pope Francis. There is, he says, a nobility in the duty to care for creation, even through little daily actions. And I think it is a very powerful sentiment that we should take on board. Such actions embrace empowerment over fatalism and hope over despair. Such actions are a humble acceptance of an interdependent destiny in the natural world and not an arrogant presumption of human exceptionalism. This is a call for stewardship, not for dominion over nature. Mother Nature is speaking to us in increasingly threatening and angry ways. Floods, fires, droughts, storms, heat, cold. All of these things are speaking angrily and more clearly. In the end, we each as a human being, no matter where we live, remain totally dependent on the bounty of this one small planet that gives us our place at nature's feast. We should treat this bounty with the care it deserves. History has made us the beneficiaries of human ingenuity and also the inheritors of human folly. How this duel between ingenuity and folly is fought out will determine our planet's and our own future course. I hope that for us, and more particularly for our children and grandchildren, that we are embarking on the battle of a lifetime for the sake of their lifetimes. We must not fail, and I thank you for this honour and for your attention.
Una indisposición de última hora de José María Gil Robles, un colega nuestro, le ha impedido venir aquí como hubiese sido su deseo, y nos consta que tenía gran ilusión de asistir en este acto y compartir este momento de incorporación de Pat Cox en nuestra Real Corporación. Paso, con el permiso del señor presidente y siguiendo sus indicaciones, a leer el texto que nos ha enviado. Queridos amigos, hoy toma posesión como académico correspondiente para Irlanda de nuestra Real Corporación un gran líder europeo. Patrick Cox no empezó su carrera política por el Parlamento Europeo. Es europeísta de convicción desde sus tiempos de estudiantes en el Trinity College de Dublín y joven profesor de Economía en el Instituto de Administración Pública de Dublín y en la Universidad de Dublín. Y poco después, a triunfar como periodista radiofónico en el programa de televisión Today Tonight, informando a sus conciudadanos con brillantez y profundidad sobre todas las cuestiones de actualidad, incluido, claro está, el proceso de integración europea. Se incorporó a la política nacional irlandesa y con ese bagaje llegamos a 1989, el año de la caída del muro de Berlín, llegando al Parlamento Europeo en ese año. En 1998 sería elegido presidente del Grupo Liberal en dicho Parlamento, grupo que dirigió con mano maestra. Yo fui un integrante del grupo y soy testimonio de que lo dice el señor Gil Robles, es totalmente verdad. Estaré siempre, dice Gil Robles, estaré siempre agradecido a su apoyo sin reservas para superar las dificultades de aquellos años en los que me correspondió presidir el Parlamento y que culminaron con el pulso con la Comisión Europea, que desembocó en la dimisión del presidente de la Comisión, Jacques Santer, y la consagración del principio de que la Comisión Europea responde políticamente ante el Parlamento Europeo. En una democracia, toda autoridad ha de responder políticamente de sus actos. La Comisión no podía ni puede ser una excepción. Ni que decir tiene que he podido asistir con gran alegría a la elección de Pat Cox como presidente del Parlamento Europeo y más tarde como presidente del Movimiento Europeo y como presidente de la Fundación Jean Monnet pour l'Europe. José María de Gil Robles, antes que Pat Cox, había sido presidente del Parlamento Europeo, había sido, antes que Pat Cox, presidente del Movimiento Europeo, y antes que Pat Cox, presidente de la Fundación Jean Monnet. Y entonces dijimos, la secuencia lógica es que Pat Cox sea académico de nuestra academia. Y por esto, de acuerdo con Josep Daniel y con José María Gil Robles, miembro de esta academia, nos permitimos proponer al presidente y a su Junta de Gobierno esta propuesta para que fuese presidente el presidente actual de la Fundación Jean Monnet se convirtiese también en académico de nuestra Real Corporación. Sigo con las palabras de José María Gil Robles. Además de otras numerosas tareas importantes que los organismos oficiales europeos le han encomendado para aprovechar todo lo posible su acreditado talento. La relación con Pat Cox nos abrirá puertas importantes de relación a nivel europeo e internacional. Por lo tanto, expresar mi personal satisfacción de que hoy incorporemos una personalidad como Pat Cox. Muchas gracias.
Excelentísimo señor académico y secretario general de esta Real Corporación, don Fernando Casado, hará entrega al recipiendario del diploma acreditativo de nuevo académico. Mon cher académicien, dominar Europa fue durante milenios el motivo de cruentas guerras. Compartir Europa, en cambio, y construirla juntos nos ha permitido disfrutar al fin del más largo periodo de paz de la historia. Pero si la guerra ha sido durante demasiado tiempo el resultado del fracaso de la diplomacia, la paz debe serlo ahora del triunfo del principio de la prosperidad compartida para todos los pueblos. Ese es el reto económico de nuestra Europa hoy: generar riqueza y distribuirla para convertir el bienestar en el más sólido cimiento de nuestras democracias. Y ese es el reto que ha asumido como propio nuestra Real Corporación en toda la incansable labor de proyección europea y europeísta. Italia, Portugal, Suiza, Bélgica, Finlandia, Rumanía, Montenegro, pero también Moldavia, Bielorrusia, Ucrania, son unos países de la Europa ya integrada en la Unión Europea y otros que lo estarán, estoy convencido. En todos ellos, así como en los de 3 continentes más, hemos trabajado en misiones internacionales con economistas y académicos locales para convertir nuestra tarea de creación y divulgación científica en instrumentos técnicos capaces de potenciar la prosperidad compartida. ¿Nos falta Irlanda? Sí, excelentísimo académico Dr. Pat Cox. Esperamos visitarla pronto con usted. Una Irlanda que puede convertirse en un contrapeso de lo que consideramos desgraciado error, el Brexit. Sabe, Excelencia, que nos tiene ahora más que nunca a su lado para que se constituya en el gran puente de la Unión Europea, aquella que mira hacia el futuro. Por eso, desde la renovada convicción en nuestra misión europea, celebramos tenerle como académico, pero no solo como un honor, sino como el inicio de una colaboración que pronto se convertirá, estamos seguros, en nuevas realidades económicas. Irlanda sufrió, como España, una importante recesión en los años posteriores a la crisis del 2008, que nos llevó al borde del colapso. Hemos salido reforzados de ella, tanto Irlanda como España, con un modelo económico mejorado. Falta, sin embargo, que esta renovada prosperidad esté mejor repartida. Falta, con el permiso de la austeridad alemana, más Unión Europea, más unión bancaria, más unión fiscal, más unión en suma, pero más auténticamente europea. En estas mismas paredes, el que fue también gran académico de la Real Academia de Ciencias Económicas y Financieras y amigo, el doctor Raymond Bach, me decía, ante los tropiezos que jalonaban la construcción de Europa, Europa será una realidad, aunque en el proceso tengamos que retroceder unos pasos para tomar fuerza y andar después más deprisa. Y así fue, y así será en el futuro. Y lo será porque trabajaremos juntos para tener más Europa y más Real Academia. A ella le damos la bienvenida, profesor Cox, para coordinarnos hacia la prosperidad a la europea, es decir, compartida. Lo conseguiremos porque estamos construyendo un mundo con menos fronteras y más solidaridad y compromiso entre europeos, y en especial entre europeos con su talento y convicciones. Excelentísimo académico doctor Cox, sea usted bienvenido.